Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Dhamma discussion here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So my name is Bhante Suddhaso, and I'm here this evening with Bhante Jayasara to my right. And this evening we'll be having another Sangha panel discussion. So the topic that was suggested to us was to talk about the Four Noble Truths. And as I was saying a moment ago, this is a topic which never goes out of style. It's never irrelevant because this is the first thing the Buddha taught, the last thing the Buddha taught, and the only thing the Buddha taught. So this actually is the entire Buddhist teaching. It's the Four Noble Truths. There was a really lovely incident which happened a few years ago. We had invited a very senior bhikkhuni from the Tibetan tradition, Venerable Robina Cortine, and she was giving a talk on the Four Noble Truths. And after the talk, during the Q&A, somebody said, when are you going to talk about the advanced topics? And she actually got kind of upset, and she was like, this is the advanced topic. And that's always stuck in my mind, because we do sometimes have this attitude of like, oh, Four Noble Truths, that's the beginner stuff. I learned that years ago. But actually, Venerable Robina Cortine, she was pointing out, no, the Four Noble Truths are not the beginner stuff. This is the advanced material. And we also see this when the Buddha talks about the gradual teaching. So Anupulbi Kata. So Anupulbing Kata, the gradual teaching, which we find mentioned in a number of suttas. The Four Noble Truths comes at the end. So the Buddha starts off talking about generosity, morality. He talks about heaven and hell. He talks about karma and rebirth. He talks about the blessings of renunciation and the dangers of sensual indulgence. And then only after he's laid a solid foundation in these kinds of understandings does the Buddha start talking about the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, again, we can talk about it as being the basic foundation of all Buddhist practice, but it's also the most advanced pinnacle of the Buddha's teachings, and everything in between. So whether somebody's a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, the Four Noble Truths are a relevant topic. They're something which is worth talking about. And also just recognizing that the only people in the world who fully understand the Four Noble Truths are arhants and Buddhas. So unless you're one of those, and let's be realistic, you probably aren't. So unless you're one of those, then you don't understand the Four Noble Truths. So, which means it's worth talking about them and thinking about them and really coming to a deeper understanding of what these actually are. And most importantly, how to apply our understanding of the Four Noble Truths in our own practice. Since ultimately Buddhism is practical. It's not intellectual, though it has an intellectual component, but rather it's practical. It's something that you do with your life that brings about a genuine transformation of the heart. So I think I'll go ahead and pass it over to Bhante Jayasara, if you'd like to start talking about either continuing with an overview of the Four Noble Truths, or if you'd like to jump right into talking about number one, as you see fit.
I guess I'll cover a few points. Obviously we know the famous simile of the elephant's footprint, right? Where the Buddha says that just like all of the footprints of all the great animals on the land fit within the footprint of the elephant, so too do all the teachings fit within the Four Noble Truths. So it's important that we understand that this connection and how deep the Four Noble Truths are, as Bhante says, when Buddha is asked a definition for avidya, he says not knowing avidya, ignorance, not knowing the Four Noble Truths. So this is not I learned this 5 years ago in beginner Buddhism thing. This is you might intellectually know them, but do you experientially know them? That's the important thing about the Four Noble Truths. There's something that unfolds as you practice, as you go down the path. It's something that you gradually come to understand. And for me, as somebody who's been a lifelong truth seeker, I've not found anything more truth than the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha. Right? These are something that to be understood, investigated, and practiced, and so that we can truly know these truths with our wisdom.
So thank you for sharing those words. And I think we can go ahead and start with talking about the first noble truth. So the first noble truth is idang dukkha in Pali. So a very simple two-word sentence. So idang means this, and dukkha means, well, dukkha. So the first truth is that the Buddha says there is dukkha. This is dukkha. So this is a very important statement, and it's important that this be translated correctly. So idang dukkhang means there is dukkha. Dukkha exists. So he's not saying all life is suffering, as you sometimes will hear this truth translated. It's not what he's saying, but rather he's saying that dukkha exists. Dukkha is a fact of life. Dukkha is a central component of our experience. And it's also important to note that in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is usually considered the Buddha's first formal discourse, the Buddha further went on to say, dukkhang parinyaya. So parinyaya means it should be fully known, fully understood. So the first statement he makes is, there is dukkha, it does exist. And the second important statement he says is that dukkha should be fully known, fully understood. So then the question is, well, what is dukkha? And I find it very informative to look at the etymology of the word dukkha. So it comes from the prefix dur, which means difficult, and the root ka, which means to hold something or endure something. It's actually the same root that we get the word kanti from. So you might be familiar with the word kanti as meaning patience or meaning endurance. It also means forgiveness or acceptance. So then dukkha is something that is difficult to endure, difficult to hold, difficult to accept, difficult to forgive, difficult to tolerate. So for example, when you run out of water and you're thirsty, well, that's dukkha. That's a sensation that's difficult to endure. It's difficult to accept. When your loved one breaks up with you, you're deeply in love with someone and then they decide they don't want to be with you anymore. Well, that's dukkha. That's difficult to endure. It's difficult to accept. It's difficult to forgive. When your mom dies, well, that's dukkha. It's difficult to endure. When you don't get something that you want, or when you get something that you don't want. These are all things that are difficult to endure. And so the Buddha, he actually summarizes it quite simply. He says, any aspect of our experience, when affected by grasping, is dukkha. So in Pali, this is panchupadana kanda dukkha. So any of the 5 components of our experience, when affected by grasping, upadana, is dukkha. It's uncomfortable. It's unsatisfying. It's unpleasant. It's hard to endure. It's hard to bear. So the Buddhism often starts from facing up to the unpleasant truths about life. If you go through life pretending that nothing is wrong, then you'll never fix anything. I actually remember when I was a teenager, at one point I got an injury on my ankle. And at the time, the shoes I was wearing would rub against my ankle when I was walking. But I really liked those shoes, and I didn't want to wear other shoes. So I just convinced myself that there was nothing wrong, and I could just keep walking around in those shoes, even though I kept rubbing against the wound and reopening the wound over and over again. And finally, after a few days, I just had to admit to myself, this isn't working. I had to wear different footwear for a while until my ankle properly healed. So in the same way, if we just pretend that there's no dukkha, then we'll never fix it. And we'll just keep irritating our mind. We'll just keep generating more suffering, more pain, more discomfort. So the first thing is actually directly facing dukkha and having the willingness to not just acknowledge the existence of our own discomfort and dissatisfaction, but actually allowing ourselves to feel it fully. to know it completely through direct experience. And it's only when we fully know it that then we start to become capable of doing anything about it. Do you have anything you'd like to say about dukkha? Do you want to pick up the ball?
Sure. I was going to, I guess, go in a little bit a different way talking about dukkha. Sometimes people will ask, well, if all the teachings are in the Four Noble Truths, then well, where is this in the Four Noble Truths? Or where is that in the Four Noble Truths? And I can give you a little glimpse of if somebody says, well, where is anatta? Where is not self in the Four Noble Truths? And this is something that you can find in the definition of dukkha. So as Bhante was saying, the Buddha says, in brief, the 5 aggregate subjects of clinging are dukkha. In the sutta, the Buddha is asked, identity, what is identity? And the Buddha says, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. In the sutta called Bhara Sutta, the burden, the Buddha says, what is the burden? The 5 aggregate subject to clinging. Who carries the burden? The person. What is the laying down? What is the taking up of the burden? This very craving. What is the laying down of the burden? The letting go of this craving. So the Buddha is literally telling us in the definition of the First Noble Truth that identity is suffering. Identity is the core of our suffering. It's amazing, isn't it? It's and this is why one of the many reasons why the Four Noble Truths is not a beginner teaching. It's very advanced, very deep, very hard to see. And to go back to more practicalities, when I first heard the definition of dukkha that Bhante just explained, when I first heard that, difficult to bear, like that connected with me. Because if you look at the definition the Buddha gives, old age is difficult to bear, sickness, illness, all of these things, death is difficult to bear. Very hard things to bear. And as Bhante said, yes, we part of really understanding what this is to courageously, bravely face these truths, to see to our normal habitual, our underlying tendency is to run away from them. But we have to know them very well, very deeply, experientially, not intellectually. We have to see these truths for ourselves.
Yeah, so again, this is coming back to a very important element of Buddhism, which is that ultimately it's something experiential. So we use our intellect as a way of starting to understand how to experience things. But it's the experience itself that is the basis for the arising of wisdom. And so it really is important to really closely examine how does our dukkha feel in each moment. So this is actually a practice that you can do at any time. You can ask yourself, how does dukkha feel right now? Or what is my dukkha right now? What is the dukkha in this moment? And you'll find there's probably some story wrapped around it, but try not to get caught up in the story. Just look at the feeling itself. And you'll feel it. It's there. There's this feeling. It's like a needle in your mind. It's this feeling like sandpaper rubbing across the surface of the mind. It's this subtle feeling of wrongness. Like when you're drinking water that's just a little bit dirty. Something a little bit off. Or food that's just a little bit too close to spoiling. Like there's something a little bit wrong here. So when you look at your mind, you can feel that current of dukkha. And as you pay attention to that dukkha, then you can start to understand what it's coming from. You can start to understand what's causing it. Which is leading into the second noble truth. But before we get into the second noble truth, there's one more sutta quote that I'd like to bring forward. And it's from the Kachanagota Sutta, which we chant here at the monastery every day. And it's actually one of my favorite quotes in the entire Pali Canon. Though I say that about so many quotes from the Pali Canon, I can't really be believed on this. But it actually is one of my favorite quotes from the Pali Canon. So the Buddha says, dukkhameva upajamanang upajjati, dukkhang nirujamanang nirujjati. Which means it's only dukkha that arises and dukkha that ceases.
Yeah. In the Samyutta Nikaya, Bhikkhuni Vajira is Mara comes to her and says something, and she says, "Oh, she was talking about how is this your theory? This person, this theory is like when the parts come together, it's called chariot." And then she says, "But there's only dukkha arising and only dukkha ceasing."
Yeah, so this is actually every moment. So every sankhara, so every distinct phenomenon, every distinct experience. What is it? It's just dukkha arising and dukkha ceasing. That's all. So this is pointing to another layer of dukkha. So we often talk about dukkha as a subjective experience. So, for example, in Buddhist circles, you'll hear people saying things like, "Oh, I'm experiencing a lot of dukkha right now," or "I've been having a dukkha day," and that's talking about the experience of dukkha. But we also use dukkha as an adjective, and this also is where the Buddha says things like "sabbe sankhara dukkha," so all things are dukkha. So here, what he's using the word dukkha as an adjective. So saying all things are unsatisfying. All things are inherently unsatisfying. They're inherently unpleasant, actually. In the suttas, the Buddha also says sukha is dukkha. So sukha means pleasure. So the Buddha says pleasure is also unsatisfying, unpleasant, difficult to endure, difficult to bear. So anything which comes into being is dukkha. It's inherently unsatisfying. It's something which, it might have pleasant elements to it, but the overall character of it is dukkha. And why is it dukkha? It's dukkha because we grasp at it. We try to hold on to it. We react to it. If it's pleasant, we try to pull it close. If it's unpleasant, we try to push it away. If it's neutral, we try to ignore it. Or we space out and start fantasizing. And all of that is dukkha. So this is all actually, again, pointing to the second noble truth. So why are all things dukkha? They're dukkha because we have desires related to them. We want more of the pleasant stuff and we want less of the unpleasant stuff. And all of that preference, of course, is based upon identity, as Bhante Jay was saying just a moment ago. So it's I like chocolate, I hate cilantro. I want more chocolate, I want less cilantro. It's all based upon me, my self-identity, my preferences. And then from that arises dukkha, because then you go to lunch and there's no chocolate and somebody sprinkled cilantro on everything. And you're like, so much dukkha. But where is the dukkha? Is the dukkha the cilantro? Yes, it is, just to be clear. No, is the dukkha the cilantro? No. Where is the dukkha? It's not in the cilantro. Where is the dukkha? And you start looking at your own mind. Where is the dukkha? And you realize the dukkha is not in the cilantro, but it's in your desire for something else. It's in your desire for a particular experience. You want certain sensations and you want to avoid other certain sensations. And that's where the dukkha is actually found, which then is leading us into, again, the second noble truth. So the Buddha's description of the second noble truth is quite simply that craving, tanha, is the cause of all dukkha. So maybe you'd like to say a bit about.
Well, I'd like to. What is your perception or perspective on tanha being used as thirst, which I guess would technically be the literal, but in terms of instead of craving? What would be your perception in terms of that?
I don't have a strong feeling about it. I think one of the benefits of translating it as thirst is that thirst carries a sense of desperation. Um, so, for example, I carry a water bottle with me everywhere I go because for me, the feeling of thirst is dukkha. So I actually relate quite strongly to translating tanha as thirst. Yeah, there's a feeling of desperation, a feeling of life and death, because it actually is quite literal. If you don't drink any water for 3 or 4 days, you literally die. Mm-hmm. It's really not a joke. But even long before then, if you just go without any water for even just a few hours, then your whole body starts to feel really uncomfortable. So for me, thirst, it brings in that sense of desperation, that sense of lacking something that you really need. But in a Buddhist context, like tanha it's an illusory thirst. Like we don't actually need what we're craving, but we've convinced ourselves that we do. We've convinced ourselves that it's necessary when it actually isn't. So in that sense, it's actually more like a drug addict. They've convinced themselves that they need to be high all the time, but actually they don't. It's an artificial need that's been generated through habit formation, which is actually very close to what the Buddha is talking about with tanha. We've generated this habit of wanting things all the time, of wanting certain experiences. And then because of that, we experience this intense craving. So for these reasons, I actually do lean more towards craving. So we talk about somebody craving alcohol or craving attention. We don't normally say like, oh, I have an intense thirst for intoxication. Actually, sometimes you say that. Or a thirst for attention. We do sometimes say that, but it's more poetic. I don't really have a strong feeling about it.
Well, I ask because I have a strong feeling of preferring it, but I don't know if I can verbalize the exact reasons why. I think for me, craving is kind of too strong in a way, and can get people like, when you're talking about tanha and upadana, it's like upadana feels like a strong, like thirst is like this underlying, we have this underlying desire for what? For kama tanha, for sensual pleasures, right? Like an unquenchable thirst for sensual pleasures, for existence, for non-existence. And then you have this, the stronger is the upadana of the clinging to that, or clinging for it. So that's it's something, the reason I asked was to see your perspective on it, because it's something I'm still thinking about in terms of fully clarifying it. But yeah, this tanha, like the way I kind of see it is the Buddha says that there is a kamogha, there's a flood of sensual pleasures. Like, if you see like a Matrix view or something, we're just like under the water of sensual pleasures all over, right? There's, even in this room, the eye, ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, there's, who knows, uncountable ways that we can have pleasant experiences. Right? And because we have a thirst for them, when it comes to the end of our life, I haven't even experienced 1/10,000th of all these wonderful things. I want to keep going.
My bucket list is still full.
Yeah, exactly. And so then that is kind of like the driver that brings us to the next life.
That's actually really interesting, what you're pointing out about the nature of tanha. I actually do feel this is one of the problems of translation, is that it's so difficult to pick a word that really pins down the meaning of any particular Pali term. But pointing out that tanha is more like this pervasive underlying tendency of mind. Because actually, similarly to how I don't like translating dukkha as suffering, because suffering is too strong a word. Whereas dukkha covers also even just this very subtle feeling of discontent. Like even when you're having the most pleasant, enjoyable experience, it's still dukkha. You look at the mind and there's still this subtle current of discontent, even when you're having a great time. And I guess for the same reason, actually, I see your point about translating tanha as craving. Because I've known people who, when they start learning about Buddhism, they're like, oh, I don't have any craving. And I'm like, whatever, sure. And you look at their mind, you're like, what are they actually doing with their life? And they're actually always like, oh, I want this. Oh, that looks nice. Oh, okay, yeah, some of that. And it's like, well, that's tanha. And they'll be like, oh, but it's not craving. They're like, I don't have any suffering. I don't have any craving. And it's like, well, okay, but you've got dukkha and you've got tanha. And so actually, I often lean back towards just translating tanha as desire. But then we get into the old problem of there's about a dozen different Pali words that all can be translated as desire. Yeah, like chanda. Actually, chanda I like to translate as interest. When you have an interest in something. So much more mild word.
It's like different for different people. The strength of dukkha is different for different people. And also like until we attain nirvana, the desire of attaining nirvana is also dukkha. Maybe a subtle, but
Yeah.
it's craving.
Yeah, I mean it's true. And also the strength of our dukkha is directly related to the strength of our desire.
And to something that you mentioned it briefly when you talked about sankharas, but one of the things that I think is important when we're talking about dukkha to kind of understand the scope of it is the three types of dukkha that the Buddha talks about. Dukkha, which is like the physical pain of dukkha. Then viparinama dukkha is like the changing nature of dukkha. Like as you get older, you really experience viparinama dukkha. And then there's the place where I always say that technically the Buddha does says life is suffering. That's sankhara dukkha. Because literally everything outside of nibbana is sankhara. It's created, right? And so when you have that very subtle, deep ability to see really what it is, then you say, oh yeah, sankhara dukkha. But until that point, most people can understand dukkha. You can just, oh yeah, my body's this pain or that pain. But a lot of people can't understand. Well, I guess in philosophical terms, what they would say what's the word I'm trying to think of? Existential crisis or existential suffering, right? They might not see that deeply, but they can understand like physical suffering. So they say, oh no, I don't have any dukkha. And, life is good. There's lots of good things in life. And then there's also bad things. They have these kind of various ways of explaining. But Buddha is basically like when you see deeply, yes, sankhara dukkha.
Yeah, I tend to think of that as pervasive dukkha. Like that dukkha is something which is, an inherent component of everything. Dukkha is the building block of reality. Kind of like Legos, everything's made out of little blocks. So and like all of reality is made out of little blocks of dukkha. This is what passes for humor in Buddhism. So again, the second noble truth. Why do we want to pay attention to tanha? Why do we want to understand our thirst, our craving, our desire? It's to understand that this is itself dukkha. So this also is an interesting practice. Whenever you find yourself wanting something, so whatever it is, maybe you want to take a nap, or you want to eat ice cream, or you want to watch a movie, or you want to go for a walk, or whatever. It actually doesn't matter what it is. Look at the wanting. Forget about the object entirely, because it's actually entirely beside the point. It doesn't matter what you want. Look at the wanting. Pay attention to the wanting itself. What does the wanting feel like? Is that a happy feeling or an unhappy feeling? Is that a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling? And invariably, you'll see that desire is itself an inherently unpleasant feeling. And usually the reason why we don't notice this is because we're so fixated on our idea of the presumed pleasantness of getting what we want. So we're so caught up in fantasizing about how nice it will be when we get what we want that we're not noticing how much pain we're causing ourselves by fueling that wanting. So the present moment activity is actually an activity of self-torture. And so the Buddha, he actually, again, on the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, just as he gave a task for dukkha, so dukkha is parinyeya, it's to be fully understood, fully known. In the same way, he gave a task for tanha. So he said, tanha is pahatabba, means you should throw it away. That's what it means. You should discard it. You should let go of it, get rid of it, because it's not doing you any good. It's just a way that we torture ourselves. It's just an activity of self-torment. And the good news is you can actually stop at any time. This is a really interesting practice because you can actually see how this forms a sequence. So you ask yourself, where is the dukkha? And you look at your mind and you're like, oh, the dukkha is right here. What's causing it? Okay, it's my own wanting. Oh, the wanting is an activity that I'm doing right now. So I can just stop. And then you stop. And the dukkha evaporates just like that. The dukkha's gone. And there's this moment where it feels like the clouds part in your mind. This deep serenity and joyfulness comes over the mind. And you're like, oh, so much better. Yeah, but chocolate actually is, and then you start going on about your next desire and you're right back into torturing yourself, which is why Buddhism is a practice. It's not an instant fix, because you can temporarily clear away the clouds from the mind, but our habit of cloud formation, our habit of desire formation is so strong that we just jump right back in very quickly. So it takes a long, ongoing effort to start to genuinely change the nature of the mind, to start to genuinely transform those deeply rooted habits of self-torment, those habits of desire formation that are so deeply rooted in our subconscious. So this is starting to edge into the third noble truth, unless you had anything more to say on number 2.
Yeah. So in on the series of where does this fit in the Four Noble Truths, now we'll talk about dependent origination. And this also fits in with what Bhante was saying, is where to kind of look, right? So then we go to Vedana Paccaya Tanha. With the arising of feeling comes the arising of thirst or craving, right? So dependent origination right there. And this is a good place to look. You're meditating and then a feeling arises, maybe an itch. And then you have a tanha related to that itch, to scratch that itch or something like that, right? And this is where you observe, okay, this feeling has arisen. It's pleasant or painful or neutral. And then I have a thirst related to that. I have a tanha related to that. Tanha arises. I dislike this. I don't like this. I want to run away from it. I want more of it. And you go, oh, I'm in this nice, peaceful, pleasant mode of my meditation. I want to stay in here. And then all of a sudden thoughts arise and you lose it. And then because you attach to that, because you had the thirst for that, dukkha arise. So this is a key place to look, right? To observe your tanha. And whether sitting in meditation or driving a car, you observe how the arising of feeling and then the arising of tanha. Observe how that works. You see your likes and your dislikes, what you want and what you don't want. And then you also see how your suffering arises, because it's the origin of your dukkha.
Yeah, and then also the next thing in the sequence is the construction of self-identity. So tanha paccaya upadana, upadana paccaya bhava. So bhava is who you think you are. So it's normally translated as becoming or being or existence. But years ago, I came across someone who rendered it as, what was it? Like ego existence or something like that. They're specifically emphasizing how this is bhava in dependent origination is about the formation of your self-identity. Like, I am the person who likes such and such. I am the person who can't get enough of this or can't let go of that. So our identity is very deeply rooted in our desires and preferences. So this is actually another place where anatta appears in the Four Noble Truths. It's in actually in the second noble truth as well, in tanha.
Yeah.
So and also the Buddha, similarly, he spoke about three kinds of tanha. So earlier you spoke about kama tanha, the thirst for sensuality. And we tend to focus a lot on this one because it's the most coarse, obvious, and blatant form of thirst. So we want pleasant sensations. So kama, sometimes it's translated as in a way that implies it's talking specifically about coarse sensory experiences. So for example, kama raga, people usually associate with sexual desire. But actually that's not what the word kama means. It's only one example of kama. So kama is any kind of sensory experience, any kind of sensory stimulation. So even simple things like looking at flowers is kama, or listening to the birds chirping, that's kama, or sitting on a soft cushion, that's kama, or sitting on a hard cushion if that's what you like, that's kama. All of that is a sensory experience, a sensual experience. So kama tanha is thirst for any kind of sensory experience. And this can be specific, again, like I want to eat chocolate, or I want to lie down on a soft mattress, or whatever. But it can also be generalized, just wanting sensory stimulation of any sort. Like when you're bored, when someone's really bored, then any kind of sensory stimulation will do. You can actually see this on airplanes. So on airplanes, you have a very limited selection of movies usually. So people will watch the most horrendously stupid movies that they would normally never voluntarily watch, because that's what you've got. And any sensory stimulation is better than none. So this is kama tanha, and just stuffing your mind with the most worthless garbage just in order to keep it occupied, to keep the flow of sensory stimulation going. Yeah,
reminds me of at Bhavana during the like the winter seclusions. I can remember in the middle of one of my seclusions, and I was going for a walk, and I became, whether through boredom or whatever it was, I became so infatuated with watching like this little caterpillar cross the road. Like I sat there for like 25 minutes just watching the caterpillar. So I guess it was something to do. Yeah.
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 And the other two forms of desire that the Buddha spoke about, so bhava tanha, again, this thirst for being, for becoming, for states of existence. So one way this expresses actually is when you hear someone say like, oh, I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be respected, or I want to be appreciated. So that's all wanting a particular state of existence. So not necessarily any kind of sensory experience, any kind of sensation, but rather wanting to have a certain kind of existence or a certain kind of identity. And then similarly, vibhava tanha. So the prefix vi means to separate from. So vibhava tanha is when you want to avoid certain kinds of existence or avoid certain states of being. And the most extreme form of vibhava tanha is wanting to avoid all existence. So wanting to not exist at all, which is actually not the goal of Buddhist practice, believe it or not. We're actually not trying to cease existing, but rather we're trying to thoroughly understand the nature of both existence and non-existence. So saying, I want to exist is a problem, and I want to cease existing is also a problem. Both of these are manifestations of self-identity, manifestations of self-attachment and desire. So again, vibhava tanha, I want to stop being either something in specific or in general, entirely. And again, this is just another manifestation of self-identity and craving. So if the Buddha had stopped there at the first two noble truths, that would be pretty depressing and awfully pessimistic and actually not very useful. Realistic, but depressing and not very useful. But fortunately, the Buddha carried on from there to the third noble truth, which the Buddha says there is dukkha nirodha. So there is the cessation of dukkha. So dukkha is not permanent. So everything is impermanent, including dukkha. Everything is causally arisen, including dukkha, which means that dukkha comes to an end. And dukkha nirodha, again, the Buddha gives a task, just as with the first two truths. The task here is sachikatabba, which means it's something that is to be realized, is to be experienced. Actually, the word sachikaroti, it's a compound from sa, which means with, and akki, which means eye. So sachikaroti means to see it with your own eyes. So this is a very concrete metaphor for direct experience. So the Buddha is saying that dukkha nirodha, the cessation of dukkha, is something that you should be looking for in your experience. And we can talk about two major categories of dukkha nirodha. So the final or complete cessation of dukkha is when you attain full awakening. So whether as an arhat or as a Buddha, you get the complete, total, permanent, infinite cessation of dukkha. But also you can see it in every moment. If you start looking at your mind, actually in every moment you see dukkha arising and dukkha ceasing, just as we mentioned earlier. Every moment dukkha arises and ceases. And often there actually is a tendency to fixate on the arising of dukkha. But if you look at your mind, you'll actually see that there's also dukkha ceasing in every moment. And you'll also notice whenever you let go of some desire, then there's some dukkha ceasing. You can see the causal connection here. Just as with contemplating the second noble truth, you can see that the more you generate desire, the more dukkha comes into being. Well, it's the same. The more you let go of desire, the less dukkha there is, the more dukkha ceases. So this also is a very important part of our practice, is to look for the cessation of dukkha. Feel it, experience it. And the more you pay attention to it and experience it, then the more appreciation you have for it. And the more you understand how you can change the way you're using your mind so that you experience dukkha nirodha more often, more intensely, and more deeply. So this also is a way of approaching our practice, is through practicing the realization of dukkha nirodha. Do you want to take the ball and talk some more on?
Sure, I guess kind of in line with what you were talking about, observing dukkha cease. This is something that as you practice and as you observe, the processes which you actually can feed or starve that lead to more dukkha or letting go of dukkha, and you see that you actually have the ability to make that choice, you start to, this is nice, this is peaceful, let me practice so that I can let go of more dukkha. Why am I making when you start to gain insight into these things and you start to see how much you caused yourself suffering, and you say, this is, what, I'm so happy I see this, let me try to lessen the amount of times I essentially punch myself in the head, cause myself more suffering. Let me lessen that. But we have to be able to see that. We have to be able to see the process. Right? The Buddha wants us to, not only just for dukkha, but for all sankharas, we have to know how it arises, how it ceases, to observe, to see. This is how this arises. Right? This arises, I get angry, I create suffering. And you just keep watching that. And each time you get to see it, you start to see maybe You catch it early. Oh, this is arising. Now, how do I stop my dukkha? How do I let go? Right? How do I cease this from creating more suffering? And this all comes from the investigation into our experience, to observe it very deeply, to know, and then to really contemplate the bliss of this letting go of suffering, and to celebrate it as a victory when you do that. That's no small feat. When you have actually, for a very brief moment or in a brief specific thing, you have actually acted in such a way that caused the abandoning of at least that little bit of dukkha. And you can celebrate that. Yes, this is what I have done. Now, 18 million more steps until I let go of all the dukkha. But I won this one time, right? I defeated Mara this one time. Mara's going to come back. It's not over yet. But you focus, you reflect on that. Oh, this is so nice. Right? In the thing where the Buddha says, so why am I blanking out? Sabbe sankara, I need to know what. Upada vayadamano, upajitva nirojanti, tesang vupasamosuko. Right? Impermanent are all conditioned things, subject to rising and falling away.
Having arisen,
they must cease. Blissful is it when they subside. Right? So you can focus on that understanding, that like kind of release of dukkha. You can say, oh, this is so nice. You practice for a long time and your mind starts to become less monkey mind. And you start to understand, how this thought that's arising, this is not me. I don't have to identify with this. I don't have to just immediately believe it. I can question it. And I can say, wait a second. Right? That's taking the steps to stop dukkha. That's taking the steps to act with wisdom and insight. And that's how you stop dukkha. That's how you stop yourself from acting ignorantly like a bala, like a foolish person. Right? Instead, you can act like a pandita, like a wise person. Right? And really reflect on that when you have that victory of the cessation of dukkha, and that can lead you down towards all the way.
Yeah, and fortunately, the Buddha also gave us very detailed descriptions of how to practice. So how to follow the footsteps of the wise. And that's the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. So the fourth of the Four Noble Truths is the path which leads to the cessation of dukkha. And here again, the task the Buddha gives is bhave tabba, which means to develop it, to cultivate it, to bring it into being, to make it real. So the Noble Eightfold Path is something that you do, and it's meant to be a complete life plan. So the Noble Eightfold Path it encompasses right view. So taking the time to learn the Buddha's teachings, learn the Dhamma, study the suttas, listen to Dhamma talks, engage in Dhamma conversations with other Buddhist practitioners. Really reflect deeply on what it means. And right attitude. So the attitude of renunciation, the willingness to let go of everything, actually. But especially whatever you have strong desire or attachment to. The attitudes of harmlessness and non-cruelty. So cultivating a mind of kindness and compassion. And then right speech. Right action, right livelihood. So these principles of morality, following the 5 precepts at a bare minimum, trying to live a life which is as harmless as possible, which harms no sentient beings, and which brings benefit to the world if possible. And then samma vayama, so right effort. So making an effort to remove unwholesome mind states and to cultivate wholesome mind states in every moment. Samasati, right, mindfulness. So trying to always be clearly aware of your own body and mind. And actually, the most detailed explanation of samasati is, of course, the Satipatthana Sutta, where the Buddha also talks about right mindfulness is also meaning mindfulness of impermanence. So not just paying attention to your body and mind, but recognizing that the body and mind are constantly arising and ceasing. They're always changing. They're insubstantial. And also, once again, letting go. The Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha also says over and over again that one should not cling to anything whatsoever in body or mind. And Samma Samadhi, the final aspect of the Eightfold Path, is stabilizing, collecting, unifying the mind, steadying the mind, which we mainly do through meditation practice. So learning how to bring the mind together. So putting down all of our usual reckless mental activity and actually letting the mind rest in bright, still awareness, letting the mind rest in alertness, in a stable, unified, joyful, peaceful alertness. And this is something where, again, all 8 aspects of the Eightfold Path are indispensable, and they all support each other. There's actually a lovely sutta, I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but where the Buddha says right view has 7 supports. What 7? And he lists the other 7 aspects of the Eightfold Path. Then he says, right attitude has 7 supports. What 7? And he lists the other 7 aspects of the Eightfold Path. You know the sutta I'm talking about. So what he's pointing to is that all 8 of these are interconnected. You know where it is?
Yeah, all factors support each other.
Yeah.
You are skipping the name as well.
Okay. Yeah, well, we can find it later. But yeah, so it's important to point out that Buddhist practice is something which is meant to change every aspect of our life, because every aspect of our life is tainted by desire and delusion. All of our habits are built upon desire and delusion. The habits that we have are the result of millions of lifetimes of idiocy and self-torture. So clearly that all needs to change because it's all bad. It's all destructive. It's all wrong. So we need to be willing to discard everything that we think of as me, because all of that's probably wrong. And instead build up a new way of living and acting, which is fully in accordance with wisdom. And that's what the Noble Eightfold Path is for. It's for helping us transform our life from a life of foolishness to a life of wisdom. Thoughts? Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think it's important in talking about the Noble Eightfold Path as a whole to reiterate and understand the importance of this is the way leading to the ending of suffering. Right? This is, whether you are a layperson or a monastic, if you're a Buddhist, you're practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. There's no like super secret monk, training that you look in the Vinaya and you say, oh, this is what the monks do and this is what lay people do. The Buddha taught that if you wish to practice this Noble Eightfold Path, this is the way. Right? Whether you're a layperson or a monastic, this is the way. The Buddha calls this the Arya Pariyesana, right? The noble quest or the noble search. The noble quest and noble search is the abandoning of our craving, right? The letting go of our dukkha, following the Noble Eightfold Path. Miccha Pariyesana is the chasing after sensual pleasures and acting unskillfully. So the Buddha is calling us on a journey, on a quest to follow the Noble Eightfold Path, to live the Noble Eightfold Path, to become an avatar of the path. And most people, when you hear the word avatar, you're probably thinking of the blue aliens from the movie. But at least in the ancient, like kind of Christian European way, when somebody said somebody is an avatar, they're like the avatar of compassion, the avatar of humility. It's somebody who embodied something, right? So you become somebody who embodies the path. You're walking the path. You're living the path, and it's becoming part of everything you do. It's not like, 3 o'clock I go to yoga, and then 4 o'clock I meditate, and then 5 o'clock such and such. It's literally ingrained into all of your actions. Like every part of the Noble Eightfold Path has validity in basically every waking hour. There's something going on regarding right speech, right action, right? All of these paths, right? We know that the Dhammachakra, the wheel with the 8 spokes, as Bhante was saying, right? All of those spokes support the wheel moving forward down the path. You start breaking the spokes, then the stability of the wheel starts to fall apart and the wheel falls down, the wheel breaks. And so all of these factors, very important to practice, right? And you can think of it as to group it together, sila, samadhi, and panya. Right? The sila, living by virtuous principles. Samadhi, practicing the right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi, that helps us to cleanse the mind, to develop our insight, to develop right sila, samadhi, panya, to develop panya, wisdom, the right view, to understand. Right? This Noble Eightfold Path is the quest. I mean, I'm a fantasy nerd, so I love these kind of things like quest. Go on the quest, like the hero's journey. Right? That's what the Buddha calls us, to the hero's journey. And it's not easy. It's the hardest thing that anybody can do, to follow the Noble Eightfold Path, to go against the stream. It is the way that leads to the ending of dukkha. And so it's important for us to follow this. Yeah.
Great. So maybe this is a good time to take questions. So we've, at this point, the two of us have given I think a pretty solid overview of the Four Noble Truths. So maybe we can conclude this part with 3 sadhus, and then we'll go through the questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So at this time, we'll take any questions that you might have. So I see many people joining in online. So I'm not going to go through all the names because that would take me a while. But it's good to see all of you who are joining in. So we see, so Tommy suggested a few other words for dukkha. So stress is, some translators these days like to use the word stress for dukkha. I've always found that a bit stressful. I don't particularly like that. It's okay, but I'm not a big fan. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. What kind of impressed me, the first kind of understanding I realized how complicated it is to find one English word for a Pali word was on Access to Insight, right? Tanasaro's website all the way is back 2007, 2008. And he says, it's difficult to translate dukkha. And then he literally gives a whole paragraph worth of words. And you're like, whoa. And so this is why for me, I just leave it untranslated. It's dukkha, right? And you say the word dukkha, it's like it sounds like
that's
unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it covers everything from the gross to the subtle. So if it's gonna be hard to find one word.
Yeah, and the truth is, for the more common Pali technical terms, it's useful to have a deep understanding of the meaning of the word so that you're not stuck on one translation. And also to be familiar with the common translations so that when you see translations, you can usually figure out what the person is translating as what. So when you're reading a translation and you see somebody say, all fabrications are stress, well, you can know what they actually are saying as sabbe sankhara dukkha. And then you can argue about why fabrications and stress are bad translations, but you'll understand what they mean by that. that they mean sabbe sankhara dukkha. Tommy also suggests uneasiness as a word for dukkha. That's not bad, though I'm a bit uneasy with that as well. But it's okay. Yeah.
Well, when you're bearing around all kinds of unpleasant things that are difficult to bear, yeah, it's uneasy.
And Tommy also asks, is tanha sexual or sensual? Again, those are elements of tanha. Those are things which you might have tanha for, but you can have tanha for anything, any kind of experience whatsoever. And asks, attention, please elaborate. Would it intensify when we identify it? I don't quite understand. Do you get what they're trying to say here?
Yeah, I think when we try to like connect and see what's going on, we sometimes intensify the brain because now like trying to stop the thoughts actually aggravates feelings.
Okay.
Would he mean like, like you have a pain and then you kind of like, oh, this is my pain, and you like think about it and actually makes it worse? Is that what he means? Maybe. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe, though. I mean, sometimes it feels that way in the beginning, just because you're paying attention to something that you've been trying to ignore. So it's not necessarily making it worse, rather that you're becoming aware of how bad it's been all along. Sometimes, though, we actually do get into intensifying things. So this often comes up with negative emotions. So somebody notices, oh, I'm feeling sad, and then they form an identity, I am sad. And they reinforce that identity by making the sadness even stronger. I used to do this when I was a teenager before I got into Buddhism. I would be depressed, which I was most of the time as a teenager. And I would notice, oh, I'm feeling depressed. And I'd be like, that's because I'm a depressed person. And then I would get even more depressed. And there was something which actually felt kind of sickly pleasant about it. Because by reinforcing my self-identity, even though it was a painful identity, I felt more like me. Even though me was a painful thing to be. So there can be this thing which we get into where we're actually willingly intensifying our own dukkha because it's familiar. It feels like me. So that is something to watch out for. Self-identity is not always pleasant. In fact, it's often painful, which is all the more reason to let go of it. Do you have any thoughts?
No,
okay.
That's good.
Let's see what else we've got here. Jim asks, can we sometimes just look at the three poisons as like, dislike, and me? What do you think? I think they mean greed, hatred, and delusion.
Yeah, when I think of three poisons, I'm thinking lobha, dosa, moha. Well, I can see the first two if we're going with the three poisons, like, because in its essence, lobha and dosa are a bit more than just greed and hatred. Like there is this kind of like underlying like an attachment and an aversion. A like and a dislike, I can kind of see that, but me, I mean, I guess you could say the idea of me is a delusion. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's one element of it, definitely. But yeah, it's dangerous to oversimplify the Dhamma. I actually feel like the Buddha's already done an astoundingly good job of simplifying things without losing meaning. And if we simplify things further, then we start missing out on what the Buddha was saying. So yeah, the self-identity is one aspect of moha, of delusion, but it's only one piece. So moha is pervasive. It's actually tainting every aspect of our experience. And the sense of me is at the center of moha. It's the most critical part of delusion, but it's not the only piece. Every single thing we experience is tainted by delusion until you attain full awakening. So then Sam asks, can we understand the middle way as we have kama but without tanha? For example, we still see the beautiful scenery but not attached to it. That's getting very dangerous. So this way of thinking is often used by Buddhist people to justify doing whatever they want to do. It's like, oh, I have sex, but I'm not attached to it. I make money, but I'm not attached to it. I do whatever I want, but I'm not attached to it. And it's like, okay, dude, you're attached to it. You're just attached to claiming that you're not attached to it. But you clearly are attached to these things.
Have you seen the arguments that you can be married but not attached to the person? Stuff like that. Yeah. I am married, but I am unattached.
Sure you are. Yeah, so what is true is that an awakened being still experiences sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. But they're experiencing it in a completely different way than the rest of us. So they are actually experiencing scenery without attachment. But they're also not identifying the scenery as beautiful. They're just identifying the scenery as what it is, which is sensory information, sensory stimuli. That's all. And there's no wish for it to be this way or that way, or for it to be present or not present. There's just full acceptance that this is the nature of reality, is that sometimes there's scenery and sometimes there isn't. There can be the further recognition of this is scenery which many people would identify as beautiful. This is scenery which many people would have desire and attachment in relationship to. But an awakened being's mind would not have that desire or attachment. And they would not inherently see the scenery as beautiful. So actually, if you're identifying the scenery as beautiful, then that already indicates that you're still lost in delusion, that your mind is still generating desire and attachment. It still has preference. You want the beautiful scenery, but not the ugly scenery.
And I guess to talk about also, Bhante was saying it's kind of dangerous to, the middle way is very specific. Like when the Buddha talks about the middle way, he talks about the Noble Eightfold Path, or in the middle way as dependent origination. Like it has very specific connotations. And it's probably not best to be like, well, what is the middle way here? What is the middle way there? Because I think that can kind of lead you away from I'm thinking that there could be ways that it would kind of lead you away from really what is the skillful thing that you need to do, as opposed to, oh, maybe what is the middle way in this situation? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm not clearly expounding on it, but the middle way does have very specific connotations in the suttas.
Yeah, I mean, there's the most well-known way is actually from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, where the Buddha said that the middle way is not getting caught either in desire for sensual pleasure, sensory stimulation, or caught in the desire for pain. So not either pursuing pleasure or pain. So the middle way is not pursuing pleasure or pain. He talks about the middle way in a few other places in the suttas in different ways. In the Kacchanagotta Sutta, he talks about the middle way as not getting caught in seeing things as either permanently truly existent or as permanently truly non-existent. So not getting caught in the idea that things are either real or not real. But yeah, it's not gazing at beautiful scenery without attachment. I don't think that's what the Buddha was talking about. Then Hassan asks, what is Pabhasara Chitta, luminous mind, which is in the suttas? That's a great question for monk chat tomorrow. So that's a little off topic for today, though it's a great question, just not for today. Then so Sud says, since for right effort one needs to cling to wholesome actions to develop them, then this type of clinging seems to take one away from dukkha, but you stated all clinging is dukkha. Yeah, that's true. Clinging to wholesome things is also dukkha, and it also leads away from dukkha. That's exactly correct. It's the simile of the raft, the famous simile of the raft, where the Buddha says you use a raft to cross the flood, But once you reach the far shore safely, you leave the raft behind. So the raft is the Noble Eightfold Path. So you cling to the raft in order to get safely to the far shore, which is awakening. But once you attain awakening, then you let go of everything entirely. So yeah, it's true. Attachment to Buddhism is also dukkha, but I just ask anyone who's been a monk for a while. But it's the kind of attachment which eventually leads to the cessation of dukkha. And actually, it starts right away. When you start practicing the Eightfold Path, then your dukkha starts to diminish immediately.
Wasn't in the Majjhima Nikaya, somebody asked Ananda, is there such thing as like good craving or good desire? And he says, yes, the desire that leads to the ending of all desires. I don't remember specifically what sutta is.
I know the one you're talking about, but I would have to look it up. I don't remember either.
I mean, you can like act in ways that lead towards wisdom and still be full of ignorance. It's like, it's a gradual process. Yeah.
Then Olga asks, the dukkha of following the war in Ukraine is hard. I have relatives there. How to deal with it? Well, it's actually quite challenging when you have relatives who are in dangerous or difficult situations. Because, of course, there is attachment to operating, but there's also compassion. And compassion for one's relatives is something which the Buddha praised. So the Buddha said it's actually very important to care about your relatives, especially your parents, but also your siblings, your children, your extended family. It is important to care about them. At the same time, we also need to recognize that we cannot control their lives. We cannot control their experience of pleasure or pain, gain or loss. We can wish the best for them, and we can do our best to help them, but our ability to help is very limited. So to some degree, you just have to practice equanimity. So cultivate compassion, help to the extent you can, but also have the equanimity of knowing that ultimately there's not much you can actually do.
Yeah. I when I talk to people about these kind of things, I talk to them about, so if you have no connection to Ukraine and the war is kind of harming you in a way and like obsessing you, then there are ways that you can observe how this is something that's unskillful, right? To reflect on all the stuff that's going on in the world. But if you have a connection to it, for instance, my online community, we have an 18-year-old boy, a guy who's in Ukraine, right? And we've been talking to him since it started and just encouraging him and letting him, speak. And actually a few of the people in the Sangha, in the group actually like put together some money for him so he could, him and his grandmother could go somewhere and stuff like that. And so if you're involved in it, then you can do what you can. But also, as Bhante, I think, is very wise words that a lot of people don't like to hear. Like if you're not directly in it, there's sometimes you just have to kind of understand that there's not much you can do. And at me as the monastic who this gentleman kind of looks to for advice and things like that, I talk to him about the Dhamma and what he might want to try to do and not do and things like that. But I can't tell him exact. I'm not there with him, right? He has to kind of he has to make the choices, and he's telling us what he is doing and trying to avoid being drafted to actually fight and kill people and try to just help people and all these kind of things. And but in the end, I'm not there with him, right? And his actions are not my karma. That's his, and we can be supportive. We can be the ear that listens, right, for frustrations and things like that. But we're on the other side of the world, and what we can do is limited. But we can try to do what we can and have the equanimity, as Bhante says, with what we can't.
And Next, Lewis asks, are there any similarities between recognizing the noble truth of suffering and depression? Could depression indicate beginning to see a little bit of the truth? Well, I will say that there is mentioned in the suttas two kinds of depression. So the depression of the householder and the depression of the renunciant, which I've always really adored. So the depression of the householder is when you can't get the sensual pleasures that you like. So like boring. Like your favorite TV show gets canceled. You go to the store and they ran out of chocolate, like that kind of boring stuff. But then the depression of the renunciate is thinking like, oh, when will I attain the peace and joy that the noble ones enjoy? So that's when you have this realization that there actually is a sublime, blissful happiness that can be attained through spiritual practice, but you're not there. And you've got a long ways to go. And then there's like, oh my God, horrors. Well, yeah. But then you get over it and you get back to practicing. And actually you come back to experiencing dukkha nirodha. So this is one of the real benefits of paying attention to dukkha nirodha. Is you start to realize that that happiness and bliss and peace, which you're imagining you'll experience sometime off in the future, you're actually already experiencing it to some extent. Maybe not completely or as fully as you would like to, but you're already experiencing a little bit of that sublime happiness that the noble ones experience. And then, yeah, your depression will lift. So there is this depression of the renunciate, and it can be overcome through contemplating dukkha nirodha, seeing the blessings of the practice that you're already experiencing. Anything? Okay. Then the last question, Bhavani asks, I understand dukkha as sadness due to various sufferings that in turn result from various causes. Is this correct? And yeah, that's one way of understanding it. So the causes, once again, are our own desires, our wanting. When you want anything, then you have dukkha. That's really all there is to it. So sadness is one way that we can describe the experience of dukkha. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's it from online. Any questions from in person? Yeah, go ahead.
So the silence we experience sometimes during meditation, sometimes we take it as a theme for meditation. Can we say is practicing or knowing noble truth like the cessation?
So you're asking, is the silence that we sometimes experience during meditation, is that experiencing the third noble truth? Well, look closely at it. When you feel it, what does it feel like? So the character of dukkha nirodha is a sublime bliss. Yeah, there's a sense of happiness, of spaciousness, of relaxation and ease. It's all mental. It's not physical, though it's often accompanied by physical pleasure. But it's a mental ease, spaciousness, relaxation, bliss. Yeah, so look for it. Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
I had a question when I was in India, while listening to the talk, I suddenly remembered that when I was not familiar with the noble truth, I used to feel like, as the Buddha says, appehi sampurogo dukkho. And similarly, the three things coming in contact with the dukkha, or not getting what we want, or the separation from what we like, can say. So there is sometimes a tendency that okay, what I don't like, I can avoid easy. what I like, I can always keep on going. And then in case I run out of it, I can again keep on doing things like keep going the addiction part. So I was wondering like how then the noble truth would work, because sometimes I can see there's a sort of frustration that comes in which leads to the either search or bewilderment. But yeah, like how to
Well, first off,
explain that thing?
first off, ask yourself, can you get what you want 100% of the time? Can you avoid what you don't want 100% of the time? That's the first question. The answer is usually no. But assuming that you live some magically charmed life where you always get what you want the moment you want it, and you always avoid things you don't want, well, the next thing to ask yourself is, well, when you get what you want, is it 100% completely satisfying? Again, the answer is no. But assuming that somehow you also always get things that are completely 100% satisfying, then ask yourself, does it last forever? And again, the answer is no. And this one you can't avoid no matter how much you want to, because nothing lasts forever. In fact, nothing lasts longer than a split second.
I met a person, like, and he was like telling, confessing that there is an information like you, like the Goenka retreat usually tells, don't get affected by what you like, and don't get attached to what you like, and don't get stressed by the things you don't like, and just let go. And it was like uh, separation is anyway is going to happen. Then why not do it again and then let go? Do it again and then let go. And like there is a trap in which usually the lay people get in, being not knowing the Buddhism or the Dhamma thing. Then like, when they come and they are like, okay, like just like an addict, because he was like a sex addict sort of thing, that I can like have a sex and then let go. Then again thirst comes. Why should I not complete my thirst instead of letting it go? This sort of thing.
Yeah, and again, that's a very dangerous way of thinking, because you're fueling your desire. So maybe on the surface of the mind, you feel some temporary relief, but because you're fueling the subconscious habit, it will just keep coming up again in the future. So the dukkha will keep recurring until you face it. We all have our own addictions of one sort or another. And it's different for different people. And at some point, we need to look at our mind and figure out, what are my primary addictions, and what can I do about it? So for some people, it's spacing out or fantasizing. I knew one person who had actually come on many meditation retreats. And one day I was talking to her about her meditation practice. And she actually revealed to me that she doesn't really meditate. She just writes stories the whole time in her mind. And she told me that she can actually keep 4 simultaneous storylines going at the same time, of like these books that she writes in her mind when she's supposed to be meditating. And I was actually impressed. I was impressed that she can do this kind of mental gymnastics. But I was also incredibly disappointed that she'd been wasting so much time during all these retreats. And I've seen myself do similar things during retreats in the past, where I just start generating stories, or generating characters or worlds. I used to write fiction when I was a layperson, so every now and then my mind starts going back into that, and it's realizing, wow, this is actually a huge waste of time. So for her, that was her addiction. Her addiction was generating fiction stories in her mind. For other people, you mentioned someone who's addicted to sexual activity. Well, and that's extremely common for lay people. People who are addicted to food, that's really common too. So we all have our own particular issues. And at some point, we need to start facing it and working through it. But we also need to recognize that there's many elements of the path to work on. So we also need to be realistic. Like, we're not going to fix all of our problems instantly, but rather you pick something to work on and you work on it. And as you get better with that, then you start working on something else. And as you get better with that, you start working on something else. So over time, you start working on everything. So it's okay to say, like, okay, this part of my kalesas, I'm going to save that for next year, maybe. But I'm going to work on these other parts for now. But you're realistic. You're like, okay, this actually is a defilement. It's a problem. I need to deal with it eventually. But for now, I'm focusing on other parts of my practice, and I'll get around to that later. That's okay. It's a problem when you tell yourself, this isn't a problem and I'm never going to do anything about it. That's where you're having problems, because then you actually will stop making progress at some point. Your practice will stagnate. So we should go ahead and end. It's getting close to the end of our time. So we can go ahead and close the evening with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.